Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the history of experimental sound art. So to start off, sound art sort of emerged in the 1970s and 80s around the same time as performance art. And it was really motivated by a lot of similar impulses and came out of similar practices. And the easiest way to distinguish between performance art and sound art is that in sound art, there's typically no human performer, and it's not really about the human body. Sometimes there are human performers, and if there are, then the focus tends to be on creating sound structures or sound architectures in a way that's more sculptural rather than the focus being on the performing body. And that'll hopefully become more clear as we go through the lecture. And so, like performance art, sound art is also really an umbrella term, so it can refer to a lot of different kinds of art, which is again why it's kind of difficult to kind of put things in one category or another, and why these categories are in general pretty arbitrary. So for this class, these are categories that I kind of lump things under, but out in the real world, a lot of people now call their music sound art. So a lot of like sample-based art is referred to as sound art these days, or things like that, more performance based art. So that's just kind of a heads up that these are, terms that I've imposed or that people impose on this material rather than say like hard and fast terms. So you can kind of rest assured that in this class, I won't ask you a question on the quiz like, is this sound art or is this performance art? Although I may describe someone as a sound artist or a performance artist. So hopefully that helps. And like performance art, one way to think about sound art is that it's time-based media. It's sound-based, time-based art often. So these are often installations in art galleries that kind of like are based on the time in which you're in a gallery or experiencing the work, or they're installations, things like that. And a lot of the impulses kind of stem from the early electronic music, live performance of electronic music that we looked at in this class. So one of the biggest forerunners of sound art is Alvin Lucier. Most sound artists will sort of point to Lucier's work as a big influence on their own thinking about sound. So if we think about, for instance, I Am Sitting in a Room, one of the things that he explores that kind of carries over into sound art is the exploration of acoustic phenomenon. So he's very much inspired by how sound works in a given space. And then if we think about music for solo performer, in that piece, he's kind of creating this sound architecture or more of like a sculptural situation. So even though there's a performing body, the focus is often more on kind of how the sound is dispersed throughout the space. So it's very much the way that space is used and the way that sound is used in space and to create a sense of space is very important. Other forerunners include Yoko Ono, especially her very conceptual and kind of critical stance towards sound. We also see people like Jean Tinguely, who's often considered more of a visual artist, but he created these sort of self-destructing sculptures, including this piece from 1960 called Homage to New York, in which it's just this like giant machine, autonomous machine that is supposed to self-destruct. And there were sound making components to this machine. So I've linked this video at the end of the lecture, and so you can watch that, but you'll get a sense of the way in which sound was sort of a part of that sculpture. Other early forerunners also include one of Steve Reich's pieces called Pendulum Music, in which there are several speakers on the ground and then performers pull back a microphone that's suspended from the ceiling, which then swings over the speaker, creating this kind of whooping feedback. And that's a really good example of also kind of his approach to process-based music. And then there's just kind of a list. Other people that we've talked about throughout this class, like John Cage and Marcel Duchamp especially, were really influential to this way of thinking about sound. Even John Cage mentioned in that short video that we watched of his, Marcel Duchamp piece called Sculpture Musicale, in which the sculpture kind of like emanates sound, and based on where you are in the space, you hear different combinations of sound. So they're all sort of other forerunners of this music. And so you can already tell that a lot of these pieces are kind of blurring the boundaries between what's typically considered performance or visual art or music in new ways. And I think that's a really important part of what sound art does, but that's also what makes it hard to categorize. Which also brings me to another important thing about a lot of sound art is that, like performance art, most sound art tends to take kind of a critical stance on kind of cultural constructions around music and cultural constructions of how we tend to hear, or how our hearing and the way things that we think of music or things that we tend to think about as art are culturally constructed. So from here, we're going to look at several examples of sound art, and we're going to go roughly chronologically. So first, we're going to talk about a piece by Gordon Monahan called Speaker Swinging. And this piece, right off the bat, there's performers in this piece. So this will kind of you can already see how the boundaries between performance art and sound art are sort of blurred. But hopefully you'll see why this is kind of in the sound art category rather than in the performance art category for this class. So Gordon Monahan is a Canadian composer and pianist, and he spent a lot of his kind of career playing in rock bands. So he's sort of in between this like rock band and experimental music world. So he is really interested in acoustic phenomena. And this piece, Speaker Swinging, was inspired by a piece of audio equipment called the Leslie Speaker. And the Leslie Speaker I think it was created for the Hammond electronic organ, and it's a speaker that's in this cabinet, and it rotates, so it spins while it plays, and this kind of creates some interesting sonic effects for organ players. And he was really inspired by this Leslie speaker, and this Leslie speaker also creates a Doppler effect, and we most commonly hear a Doppler effect when we hear a car drive by, and it basically gives this effect that even though the car is going at a constant frequency, it sounds like it increases and then decreases in frequency, so that like the pitch rises and falls. So that's sort of what these swinging speakers do. So here is a sort of image of the setup of the piece, and what you'll see is in this case there's 5 performers. Each one of them has a loudspeaker attached to a string or a cable that's connected to a bank of 9 oscillators. So these 9 oscillators are basically feeding out the same signal to each of these speakers, and then these performers basically just swing the speakers over their head to create this Doppler effect. And it creates this really interesting, almost like human living sonic sculpture sort of environment. And it's these different speakers swinging and creating these Doppler effects and kind of different phase relationships from each other. And it's just kind of a really fascinating piece. And you'll also notice when you watch it that even though the human body is a part of it and it's not really performance, it does create this really kind of evocative, sensual, almost like homoerotic atmosphere, because these guys are all wearing these matching outfits. They're wearing tight jeans, tight black shirts, and they're swinging these speakers. And so it creates this really interesting dynamic visually and sonically. And so I think that interplay between what we hear and what we see is a really important part of sound art. So even though we are focused on sound, a lot of the times the visual is really important. And I also want to point out with speaker swinging that we see with Gordon Monahan kind of a trend in sound art in general, which is using audio-visual equipment, especially the speaker, as an instrument. And this is something that we're going to see later on when we look at Nadine Robinson, who also kind of deconstructs and repurposes speakers to kind of for new ends that take kind of like a critical or an interesting stance on sound. So please go back and listen to Speaker Swinging. This is one of your required listenings for this section. So now we're going to talk about Marianne Amiche. And Marianne Amiche is a really interesting figure. She was sort of an audio engineer, a field recordist, a composer. She did a lot of different things. She's most famous for working with John Cage and making field recordings and doing the audio engineering for a lot of his pieces, or for several of his pieces in the 1980s. She also studied with Karlheinz Stockhausen, so she is definitely like a part of this tradition that we're talking about. But in her personal work, she's really interested in sound's architectural quality, but not just sound's architectural quality. She's also interested in what she calls the architecture of the ear, which is a really interesting way to think about the ear. If you think about your ear, it's very topological. There's ups and downs. It's like hills, troughs, valleys, and there's kind of this outer ear, but there's also this inner ear, and all these parts are necessary. This physiology contribute to how we hear, and our unique physiology of our own ears contributes to how we hear or don't hear certain things, or at least how we experience certain things, certain phenomena. And so she's very much interested in kind of understanding these various architectures and exploring them in her pieces. So a lot of her works use sound to create a sense of space or to orient the listener in space. And then beyond that, she also uses sound to kind of deconstruct or critique the formation of our senses. So in other words, the cultural construction of how we orient ourselves in space using our senses. So we tend to prioritize our seeing, then we tend to go to sound, but there's various ways in which we are taught to experience certain kind of spaces based on touch, smell, taste, all of our different senses. And so she really tries to confuse those senses and deconstruct them in various ways in her pieces. And the way that she does that is a lot of her pieces are these large-scale installations that are immersive. So it immerses the entire body in sound to create this kind of almost like she created a lot of these pieces in the 1980s before we really had a concept of VR or AR, but these are almost like early versions of AR or VR using just sound. And the way that she does this, and we'll talk about this a little more, is really through precise speaker placement, and also the use of like really precisely edited and augmented sound recordings or other sonic material. So we're going to talk about one of her pieces called Living Sound Patent Pending, and this piece was inspired by a Supreme Court case in the, I think, late 1970s, in which the Supreme Court ruled that life forms created in a laboratory could be patented. And so Marianne Amiche was really fascinated by this idea, and the piece really responds to this kind of commercialization of biotech research. So biotech research is kind of an emerging field at that time, and she really kind of latched onto this and was like, wow, we're really seeing a pivotal moment with this idea that life forms created in a laboratory could be patented. So you could own life forms in new ways. That really sort of fascinated her. So there are many audio and visual elements to this piece. The visual elements of this piece, the first is that it's a large-scale installation that took place in a huge Victorian mansion in, I think it was in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis in Minnesota. And this house, just kind of a trivia bit, was actually owned by Dennis Russell Davies, and Dennis Russell Davies was the conductor for the Minneapolis Symphony, but he also is really important to kind of us here in Santa Cruz because he was the musical director for the Cabrillo Festival for a really long time, and he was sort of important in getting a lot of experimental music to the Cabrillo Festival while he was the director there. So that's just a little side tidbit. So this piece took place in his Victorian mansion in Minneapolis, and in this mansion, Marianne Amiche basically constructed these sets throughout the space. So you can imagine it would be like you'd enter the house and you'd basically meander through the different rooms and experience these different audio visual sets. And the sets kind of were scenes that used props that were basically miscellaneous musical and biological accoutrements, including things like music stands with photos of DNA. She put instrument cases on the floor with like little research statements inside. She decorated pianos with petri dishes. So again, just like in kind of like a surface level way, it's not like it's hard to understand. So, she really pairs like very obvious musical elements with very obvious biological elements. And these were at multiple levels. So you can imagine that like a piano would be at almost like a chest or an eye level. These music stands were at different levels. The cases were on the floor. So she wanted people to go move their bodies to different levels. And the way that they would experience the visuals and the sound would change depending on whether they were like higher or lower physically in the space. And then the audio elements were also multiple levels. And she creates what she calls, and it's right here, structure-born sound. And a structure-born sound in which she would precisely pair speaker pairs in relationship to a wall, so that the wall or structure in the room would then almost filter the sound and then emanate on the other side to create like interesting sonic effects. So she was really interested in using structures in a place to sort of filter and manipulate the sound. She also does things where she uses precise speaker pairs to create the sense of 3D sonic shapes. So what that might mean is if you're walking through a room, it might feel like you're next to a wall based on what you're hearing, but there's actually nothing there. So she could create these really kind of interesting physical or acoustic phenomena based on what she would do with the speaker pairs and the recorded material that she put in them. And one of the ways that would work is through the various phase relationships of the sounds going out of the different speakers that might cancel each other out. Because if you think about sound waves, there's peaks and troughs, and depend on the way in which the peaks and troughs relate, they might cancel each other out at different places in the room. So she often used that phase relationship to create these spaces. And another thing that she created using sound is something called additional tones, or autoacoustic emissions, which is where, based on the sounds, the frequencies of the sounds at the different amplitudes that they're created, it vibrates the ear in such a way that the ear actually creates sounds. So the ear starts to create sounds that aren't actually in the room. So again, using these really interesting kind of acoustic and physical phenomenon to sort of deconstruct and play with listeners' senses, especially their sense of hearing. So the different sound sources that she uses include field recordings of the Boston Harbor. She used recordings of a harp. And then she filtered and layered these sounds and altered their speed and used tape techniques to alter these sounds and to go into the space. So again, she's really interested in kind of creating these, in exploring the ways in which sound is really constructed in the body, that each listener will hear sound slightly differently based on how tall they are, what their ear shape is like, what kind of awareness they have at that time, if they're bending over, if they're looking to the left, if they're looking to the right in this space, in this way that's very immersive. And she also shows this real awareness of the cultural and also the political factors that really shape how we hear and how we experience sound. So again, she takes this really critical stance towards how people hear. And this is a quote by Amy Samini, and Amy Samini has studied Marianne Amiche, and I included one of her papers as your recommended reading. But she says, living sound dramatizes bodily awareness, but at the same time queries how that awareness holds a number of governing structures in play: life, nature, body, that are coextensively materialized and implicated in different registers of analysis. And that also reminds me of something that I forgot to say, which is that there's also a real sense of narrative, of science fiction and acting microbes that are kind of present in this piece as one walks through the house and experiences the sounds and the structures that Amiche creates. So you can actually hear a bit of a recording of this piece, although it's obviously different than what you would experience in the actual place at the actual time. So next we're going to look at a German composer and sound artist named Christina Kubisch. And Christina Kubisch, her early works tended to be more kind of performance art and installations. And then she became really interested in electromagnetic induction. And so her early pieces with electromagnetic induction are in this picture here. And what she did was she took induction coils and she created these elaborate sculptures on the walls of an art gallery. And then she created these special headphones that would amplify magnetic fields. So an audience member would come into the gallery, they'd put on these headphones, and they would walk along the wall, and based on, if they were, standing totally upright or bent over, they could basically hear a sonic sculpture that correlated to these induction coils. And she also sometimes pumped recordings into these coils, or voltage to amplify it at certain places or another. And she, kind of created these sonic shapes using these magnetic induction coils. And this kind of created an interesting scenario in which the listener is really a co-creator. The audience member can really dictate what they hear based on how they choose to move throughout the space. And Christina Kubish was really kind of inspired by this idea that the listener was co-creating the piece with her. So her later works extend this idea of these sculptures out into the world. And in some ways, this was really made possible by the proliferation of basically digital technology into everyday life. So with cell phones, ATM machines, basically it's hard to go anywhere without encountering lots of magnetic fields and digital technology, electronics. They're sort of pervasive, especially if you're in a city or something like that. They're all over the place. And so she really extended this idea, and she realized there really wasn't a need for these coils anymore. And so she, again, created these special headphones that were slightly different than the ones that she used in the gallery, but basically people could walk around with these headphones in a public space and hear the magnetic fields that are always present, but we just can't actually hear them because we don't have the right tools. So she was also really inspired by this idea of kind of being able to amplify something that we experience every day, we just don't have the right tools to experience. And I think these kind of walks, things she called the electrical walks, gave listeners even more autonomy and more agency in co-creating their own experience. And I've included, after this, a short documentary in which she talks about these pieces, and so you'll get a better sense of how she constructs them by watching this. And you'll see that she often creates maps so that people, mostly so they don't get lost, but also she goes around and explores an area before she puts on an electrical walk, and sort of, brings people on a route that she finds particularly sonically interesting. And there's also lots of recordings in this documentary, so you'll be able to hear what these magnetic fields actually sound like. And it's very rhythmic. There's lots of pulses, and they're overlapping, like kind of pulses and clicks, and it's really, really fascinating sounds. And today in her work, she often combines both. So a few years ago, she had an installation at the MoMA that looked quite a bit like this piece up top, a kind of mess of coils that were suspended from the ceiling. And so listeners could use the headphones to listen to the sculpture inside, but then there was also an accompanying electrical walk that listeners could also do around the museum outside. So today she kind of combines both in her work. So that's it for part 1 of Lecture 17. Up next, we'll look at a few more recent sound artists' work. All right, so now we're going to talk about a few more sound artists that have worked a bit more recently. So first we're going to talk about a sound artist named Nadine Robinson. And Nadine Robinson has like kind of an interesting personal history. She was born in London, but then she grew up in Jamaica and the Bronx. So she comes from kind of a really interesting background in which she both lived in the Caribbean, but then she also lived in very prevalent African-American neighborhoods in the United States. And so a lot of her work uses sound to explain and kind of explore complex narratives, especially narratives related to the Afro diaspora in the United States, but also in Europe. And they're also kind of used to critique minimalist artwork. So minimalist artwork is something that we talked about a bit in class, but it's basically kind of visual art that uses kind of minimal means. It's paintings like Rothko or Barnett Newman, people like that have these kind of austere paintings that are very they uplift these kind of like white male creators and this kind of austere works, and she really wants to critique that with her works, because they often use also very kind of similar minimalist means, but also include sound in ways that sort of subvert the minimalist visuals. And again, kind of, she wants to complicate these kind of minimalist visuals that she uses. So a lot of her work, kind of like Gordon Monahan, repurposes audio equipment, in particular DJ equipment like turntables and speakers. So the piece that we're going to look at is one of her boom paintings, and she took this word boom painting from a boom box because a lot of, again, her pieces use speakers. And she also uses kind of some of the techniques of DJing, including sampling. A lot of these pieces that we're going to look at are largely arrangements, as you can see here, of speakers in these kind of architectural ways. And she was in large part inspired by the speaker arrangements of Jamaican dub musicians and Jamaican DJs. And so you'll see a picture down here on the next page of a Jamaican DJ or kind of dance hall speaker setup. And in Jamaica, these speaker arrangements were often called houses of joy, which Nadine Robinson is really inspired by. And she was also inspired by kind of the other sort of visual indicators, visual signifiers of members or members of the Black community or Afro-diasporic community, or kind of other signifying elements of the Black community. So, and then these aren't just kind of visual speaker arrangements, they also use samples. So she also tends to kind of take sounds from kind of the everyday experiences of the Black community. So this often includes things like spirituals or gospel, civil rights orators, popular music, Jamaican dub, and also classical music. So it uses a real wide range of sonic samples that she also then puts out through the speakers. So the piece of hers that we're going to look at is called Coronation Theme Organum. And this piece, you can see here, it's the same as was on the first slide, uses a crown-shaped sculpture of speakers. And this crown shape was inspired by several things. One, again, kind of the houses of joy from Jamaican dance hall culture and dub culture. But it was also inspired sort of by Haile Selassie, who was the emperor of Ethiopia and who is often kind of looked to in the Rastafarian movement as sort of like kind of like a saint of the Rastafarian movement. He was part of kind of the liberation of Ethiopia, the decolonization of Ethiopia. So he's really looked at as kind of a leader in the Afro liberation movement and often associated with the Rastafarian movement. But it was also visually sort of inspired by the organ of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, which was Martin Luther King Jr.'s church. And that is also kind of mirrored in the sounds that she uses. So she uses organ music, she uses excerpts from Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, she also uses classical music from Handel's Coronation Anthem, she uses bass riffs from Jamaican dub songs, she uses sermons, prayers, protests, so it's really just this big mess or mashup of different kind of sonic signifiers from the Black experience and the Afro-diasporic experience. And we have this quote here from a journalist who went and saw and experienced this piece, who said, "The low roar becomes an enveloping, omnipresent background hum, the chorus of a ferocious power being held in reserve. A sense of latent capacity thrums through the work. The organ-like sculpture transforms itself into an organum, an instrument of profound knowledge whose joyful noise is the clarion of change. Slowly but surely, it makes the hair stand up on the back of your neck." And that really gets to sort of Nadine Robinson's main kind of interest and goal with these pieces, which is that she sees these speakers as a site of agency and also a site of potentiality. If you can imagine, if you see a speaker out on the street, what does it do? It makes you think that like almost at any moment a sound could just come out of it. And I think something that's really interesting about these pieces that this quote kind of points to is that they're not overwhelmingly loud. They're not immersive like the Marianne Amiche pieces. They're kind of surprisingly quiet considering how large they are. And I think, again, that kind of points to this sense that at any moment you could kind of first it sort of forces you to really tune in and listen really carefully to the pieces. But the second is that it almost gives you the sense that at any moment you could be completely overcome by the roar of these giant speakers. And so it's this really kind of interesting interplay between kind of this honed attention and the potentiality that these speakers kind of indicate. So next, we're going to talk about another sound artist named Christine Sun Kim. And Christine Sun Kim was born in the United States, but she now lives in Berlin, Germany. And Christine Sun Kim was born deaf. So as a sound artist, she has a really unique and critical position on sound. A lot of her work in particular focuses on the materiality of sound, the ways in which someone can feel or see sound, the ways in which sound is multisensory, because deaf people still experience sound in many ways. People are deaf in different ways. Christine Sun Kim is what is called profoundly deaf. She's never had any experience of sound in her ears. She's never been able to hear in the way that we conventionally think of it. But lots of people that are considered deaf do have some ability of hearing in their ears, but people can still feel sound, the vibrations in their skin. They can see the ways in which sound might move something or move other people. They still have very profound experiences of sound. It's just ways that are kind of different than social norms might indicate. And so a lot of her pieces really critique the social norms around listening, around sound, and around communication. And they also critique what she calls the ownership of sound, the ways in which hearing people tend to claim ownership of sound. For instance, she will talk about in this documentary that I linked to, which is Your Required Listening, the ways in which people would always tell her to be quiet, or to stop shuffling her feet, stop chewing so loudly, stop doing these things, because they wanted to have ownership of their hearing environment. And she really says, no, why should you have ownership of this in a way that I shouldn't, you know? So a lot of her pieces are really critical of that. And she also creates what I consider sort of non-cochlear sound art or non-cochlear sound paintings. So we'll talk about those in a second. And her early work, as you'll see in this short documentary, was used a lot of loud feedback and loud noise using electronics, which is the reason why we're talking about her in this class. So she often set up speakers, which she fed in field recordings or other noise, or she used contact microphones set up to speakers, and it was kind of these sound systems, almost like some of the Pauline Oliveros pieces, where in a given space she would have things to create sound that would be hooked up to microphones to hear sound that would be hooked up to speakers. And her early sound art and the way that it relates to her later sound art is that in these early pieces she uses noise and feedback to kind of make these visual translations of sound. So you might see a speaker with like bouncy balls or things on it so that you're physically seeing the ways in which the sound moves, or it might be a speaker or a drum with a paintbrush on it so that you can see the way the paint splatters. Different ways in which sound could be kind of translated visually. And they're all sort of playful. Her work really has a sort of undeniable sense of humor about it. And now her works, she tends to do more sort of visual work where she translates kind of signs ASL visually, or she just makes these kind of non-cochlear sound paintings. So here's one of them. And she often explores this kind of semiotics that she has created, which is sort of based on music notation. So like here, the symbol for piano, which means to play quietly. She uses here, and it says piano within piano like a lunch sandwich. So she creates this kind of visual sandwich using the sound for the symbol for quiet. Other pieces include this one, suggested amount of allowing friends to sing to a baby. So she has a young daughter who she often kind of incorporates into her work and refers to in her work. Here we have my voice acts like Roy G. Biv or a rainbow. Classical flute music. Oh, here's the piano within piano like a lunch sandwich. And then one of her recent works is called Degrees of Deaf Rage, in which she kind of uses these kind of charts, these graphs, to sort of chart the degrees in which kind of certain ways that everyday encounters incite rage within her. So again, we see this kind of like critical stance towards sound and also her experience in the world is really important to her work. And I think she really highlights the deaf experience or deaf experiences that deaf people tend to have, not only in the United States, but also internationally. So please go back and watch that documentary because you'll get a good sense of kind of her, especially her early work and how she thinks about sound. So last up, we're going to talk about a sound artist named Nolan Lem. And one of the reasons why I want to talk about Nolan Lem, other than the fact that his work is really interesting, but he is still a graduate student. So this is kind of like a good inspiration to those of you that are interested in pursuing a career or even hobby as an artist or a sound artist, that it's never too early to start and be really serious about your research and your art. And you can, you can really dig in at a young age and create really sophisticated works, which is what he does. So a lot of Nolan Lem's work consists of creating these kinetic sculptures, these moving sculptures and installations that include kind of everyday objects that are automated in various ways that are driven by data. So hopefully that'll make sense soon. But he also uses machine learning and AI that kind of dictate how these various everyday objects move in various ways. And so I'll link to a bunch of videos after so that you can get a sense of how that works. But you can imagine just seeing this picture here. Here's a bunch of light switches. So if those are automated, a light switch makes a sound when it turns off, on and off, automated in various ways so that each of them click on or off at a different time in ways that are driven by data. So a lot of his pieces have a lot of layers to them. So they're not just exploring this kind of surface level automation and movement. They're driven by data that explores social issues and cultural phenomena. And he's particularly interested in kind of current social and cultural anxieties about certain things. So the piece that we're going to look at, Menagerie, explores that. Oh, and here's his research statement. So I'll read a little bit of that because hopefully that'll give us a little bit more of an indication of what he does. But he says, I create dynamic acoustic systems that render sound and movement through kinetic gesture, synchronization, and physical materiality. My work explores the interplay between process, function, and the cultural material embedded in 21st century life, where I oftentimes employ repetition of everyday objects to interrogate contemporary anxieties surrounding body-focused compulsions, automation, and technology. I'm interested in seemingly invisible forces at work within the composition of sound through the use of repetitive movement and visual phenomena. As a researcher in psychoacoustics and machine learning, my work is often inspired by experimental studies related to human auditory processing. I hope my work promotes alternative ecologies of sound and environment, one that is at once investigative, transformative, and playful in its evocation of mechanical and emotional processes. So the piece that we're going to look at is a piece that he composed this year, so it's very recent, called Menagerie. And in this piece, he repurposes gun triggers in order to sort of interrogate kind of contemporary attitudes and anxieties surrounding guns and gun violence in the United States. The materials that he used include repurposed gun triggers, 3D printed parts, motors, mechanical components, metals, plastics, electronics, and cables. He was also really inspired by models of swarm behavior, so swarms of insects, things like that, the ways in which things swarm together. And obviously the reason for that is that sometimes swarm behavior also models kind of human social behavior. So each of these triggers clicks based on data, state-by-state data surrounding firearm-related deaths in the United States. So it's really kind of focused on the problems and prevalence of gun violence in the United States. And it's positioned in this glass case, as you can see here, in a way that is sort of evocative of the ways in which birds are maybe, like taxidermy birds are positioned in a natural history museum. And the reason why he wanted to do this is to sort of show the ways in which gun violence is often kind of naturalized in the United States to create a sort of ambivalence around it so that people are kind of neutralized to not do anything about it. And we have this quote here where he says, "The empty gesture of the unloaded, cold-clicking trigger is emblematic of the listlessness of political action and redress. In this piece, this sound is used as a medium through which the trigger swarms aggregates and composites sonic mass." Sorry, that was a tough one for me to get out. But as you can see here, it's a really evocative way to kind of explore the prevalence of gun violence in the United States, to really take a critical stance on it, and also to maybe make the listener question their own inaction or stance towards this problem. So I'll make sure to link to some videos of this piece so that you can watch and experience elements of this piece on your own. So that's it for Lecture 17. Make sure that you post to this week's discussion board or ask questions there if you have them. All right, take care. Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the development of environmental sound art and acoustic ecology. So just to start off, I'm going to give us a little bit of an introduction and define what I mean when I say environmental sound art. So environmental sound art defined is the appropriation of the structures, processes, materials, and impulses from the environment. So when we say, that's kind of like a good general definition for environmental art. And so, of course, when we're talking about environmental sound art, it's sound material, sound work that kind of appropriates elements of the environment. And the environmental sound art kind of movement started really in the 1970s, and it started because of a couple different things that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But now environmental sound art encompasses a lot of different practices. So the main practice that is kind of included in environmental sound art is field recording and making soundscape recordings, but there's also newer ways of making environmental sound art. So data sonification is one, and especially if data sonification is kind of included in a musical composition. Other ways that environmental like approaches are included in music these days include also like modeling of environments or sonically mimicking elements of the environment. So I think as you'll see, today we're very much aware of the environment, and I think people want to include elements of the environment in their work. And so I think something that distinguishes maybe environmental sound art from say a piece of classical music or something that's maybe inspired by sound art is, again, there's sort of this understanding that it's including some of the structures and processes and materials of the environment. So it's sort of like a deeper engagement with the environment than just kind of saying, oh, I was inspired by being outside. Okay, so the environmental sound art kind of as a practice was sort of motivated and came about because of a confluence of three different things. The environmental movement in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, technological advancements in the 70s in particular, and then certain aesthetic developments over the 20th century. And so we'll talk about each of those specifically. So the environmental movement really got going in the 1960s and 70s. And what it really brought about, kind of starting with Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, is just like a growing general cultural consciousness about kind of the negative human impacts on the environment. So this is when there starts to be kind of mass awareness of what pollution is, about things that humans could do to conserve or preserve the environment, things like recycling, things like environmental regulations on a government level. All these things start to kind of infiltrate kind of public consciousness, mainstream consciousness. And this was not really a factor of things that people thought about before. So we really, again, have kind of Rachel Carson to thank for sort of bringing about a new environmental awareness and a new awareness of kind of humans' negative impact on the environment and on the planet in the 1960s and 1970s. And so, of course, musicians and composers make up part of this mass public that started to become more aware of this and started to kind of incorporate newer elements in their music to respond to this awareness. So the aesthetic history is basically the history of this class that we've already been talking about. So starting with people like Marcel Duchamp, who really brought about this new objectification of things from daily life and kind of separated this art-life boundary with his ready-mades. Luigi Russolo wanting to kind of capture the sounds of his environment, of the city sonically. And then in electronic music, a big influence is Pierre Schaeffer and his idea of acousmatic listening. So musique concrète aesthetically was a big influence to a lot of the early composers who made environmental sound art. And as you can imagine, I mean, some of his earliest pieces included going out and recording things out in the world. And this idea, too, of like a sound removed from its source and kind of creating these sound objects is very much in line with what composers continued to do in the 70s. And then, of course, we can't talk about a new movement without talking about John Cage. But his idea, especially, I mean, throughout his career, he was very influenced by nature, and especially the idea that art should imitate nature in her manner of operation. And I think this is where, and also if you remember that piece, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, where it's just 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence, and the idea is basically just to put a frame around the kind of incidental sounds that happen in a room at a given time. So the premiere of that place actually took place in a barn up in upstate New York, in Woodstock, New York. And so the incidental sounds that a lot of people heard was wind rustling through the trees, birds singing. It was the sounds of nature because this barn was kind of open and it was a very like, again, it was kind of a space in which there was like not a huge separation between nature or the outdoors and the indoors, what we consider sometimes to be human. So breaking that down, that duality between what we consider nature and what we consider to be more of like a human realm or not natural, is something that Cage did really pretty consistently throughout his career. And so his ideas that kind of incorporated the I Ching and elements of kind of, I think that I Ching is a good idea of like an early attempt to appropriate maybe the structures or processes of nature. And so he was very influential to these early environmental sound art composers. So these are kind of the three major sort of influences to the kind of that create the context that we see the emergence of environmental sound art in the 1970s. Oh, and sorry, I didn't mention the last. So the last is technological advancements. So in the 1970s, we start to see just the proliferation of really affordable, really easy to use tape recorders. And so you see here, this tape recorder is really pretty small compared to that massive reel-to-reel tape recorder that that was used in the 1950s and 60s, with really high quality microphones, things like headphones, become super accessible and affordable. And it made it such that, you know, basically like a kind of common middle class person could afford to buy a tape recorder and use it to go out and make recordings of whatever they wanted to. So newly affordable and portable devices made this possible as well. And so what we'll see happen is that there's sort of two strains of environmental sound art that kind of emerge in the 70s and 80s. And the first is this group of people who really set out and were motivated by the kind of impulse to preserve or conserve environmental sounds. There is this idea that like humans are destroying the environment, these sounds of our environment are going to be lost, and we need to save them by recording them. And then the second strain is more of a group of composers who were interested in kind of using environmental sounds as musical material. And they're much more interested in like practices of listening, like what we talked about, listening as a creative act, and sort of, again, trying to like not only use environmental sounds as creative or musical materials, but also kind of exploring place through sound. And that by exploring place through sound, you could also explore a lot of other kind of interesting cultural or historical or architectural elements. And again, I think there's also this sense, but with both of these strains, that there's a growing awareness of the natural world and the interconnectedness between humans and the environment. And so a lot of these pieces also just explore that. They explore this connection between humans and their environment. And I think one of the big differences is that I think the first strain, to preserve and conserve the environment, comes with this kind of moral obligation to sort of or a moral imperative that like this music or this sound can like help change the world. And the second is more of like an ambivalence about that, about whether or not music can do that. And it's more about just exploring environmental sounds, and sure, maybe increasing listeners' awareness of their relationship to the environment, but there's less of a moral imperative there. So hopefully that'll become more clear as we continue to talk. So the environmental sound art really kind of kicks off with this composer named Amory Schafer. And Amory Schafer is still based in Vancouver in Canada, and he was a professor in music composition at Simon Fraser University there. And in the 1970s, he started to go out and make recordings around in kind of the outdoor spaces around him. And he was really motivated by the idea, kind of like in this first strain, that like the environment around him is changing in a negative way and that something needs to be done to preserve it. And so he, again, is really kind of like the conservationist, the preservationist. He's motivated by this idea that like we are losing something and it is my obligation, or it's the composer's obligation, to go and preserve it by making recordings of it. And Amory Schafer is really credited by coming up with this idea of noise pollution. And noise pollution is basically the idea that like hearing too many human-made sounds can have really harmful effects on one's psyche. And so I'll get into this a little bit more, but it's kind of sets up this adverse relationship between humans and their environment, and that like human sound is morally negative and that environmental sound is like morally pure and positive. And so he really sets up this dichotomy. And I think one thing that he does that is probably like his biggest contribution to this field is that he starts to make a kind of composition that he calls a soundscape composition. So he's really credited with kind of like codifying the practice of making what we call a soundscape composition, and kind of like making a landscape painting or a landscape photograph. The idea of a soundscape is to sort of capture the sounds in a given place at a given time. And so another way to think about this, as we've kind of talked about in the class, when you make a recording of something, it's kind of like you put a frame around it, like a picture frame around it. And I think Schafer was really motivated by this idea that you could capture these sounds, that you could preserve them, that you were somehow getting like a pure sonic snapshot of this environment, of this place. But of course, because he thought that human sounds were really negative and that there was this thing called noise pollution, his soundscapes in the kind of final product were really heavily mediated and really heavily edited. So he often edited out any kind of human-made sounds, if there was talking, if there was airplanes. So the final product, you got this kind of false result that there was maybe this like pristine natural environment completely devoid of humans. And I'm sort of giving a spoiler and sort of giving you my own kind of interpretation about his work. But the spoiler is that like that's such a false sort of impression, because of course he was there holding the microphone and making these recordings. This recording would not be possible without a human mediating it and editing it. And so it's not to say that there isn't value in these recordings and these soundscapes that he made, but we should, whenever we approach someone that says a picture or a recording is like, it is this natural environment, it is a pure representation, it is a pure depiction of this thing, we should always be a little skeptical of that language, because of course there's someone behind the camera or someone behind the microphone. But another thing that Amory Schafer is also really credited for is coming up with the practice of acoustic ecology. So even though he initially started with these impulses that are kind of complicated and a little bit problematic, he became really influential, and the people that came after him tended to approach these things with more of a critical lens. So he defines acoustic ecology as the study of the effects of the acoustic environment of soundscape on the physical responses of or behavioral characteristics of creatures living within it. In particular, its particular aim is to draw attention to the imbalances which have been unhealthy which may have unhealthy or inimical effects. So again, it's this idea that like there's a lot of moral imperatives going on here, that like the acoustic world has impacts on the creatures that live in it, and he's particularly interested in like looking at these like negative or unhealthy imbalances. So I think a lot of the composers that came after him kind of took away that moral imperative and just said, look, the sounds around us have an impact. And we are interested in just like what these sounds are without the sort of like, there's imbalances, there's something that we can do about it. There's sort of like, I don't know if there's anything we can do about it, but like these are sounds that interest us and we want to record them. So I kind of gave away the punchline there, but I think it's important to kind of be a little bit critical of these, again, these kinds of approaches. So, again, even though these kind of early impulses were really problematic, he was super influential, and especially with this idea of the soundscape. And even though he originally thought of the soundscape as kind of like this more or less pure representation of a given place at a given time, that idea has really expanded since. And now we have this idea that the soundscape can be either a real place or an imagined place. It is kind of like there's a lot more creativity these days that goes into creating a soundscape. And I did include a video here, so you can go back and watch that on your own, and I'll make sure to include it on Canvas. So another way that Schaefer was really influential is that he was a professor, so he had a lot of students that he sort of trained in this acoustic ecology practice. And two of his most well-known students were Hildegard Westerkamp and Barry Truax. And we're going to focus on Hildegard Westerkamp, but for those of you that are interested, Barry Truax is really credited with, even though he originally kind of made soundscape recordings kind of in the same vein as R. Murray Schaefer, he eventually went on to develop a lot of computer programs and kind of sonic models of the environment, and more like computer models. And so he's kind of like a really interesting example of like the integration between the developments in computer music and the developments in environmental sound art. But we're going to focus a bit on Hildegard Westerkamp. So Hildegard Westerkamp studied with R. Murray Schaefer, and her early work was kind of making more soundscape recordings, like the traditional kind of soundscape recordings that R. Murray Schaefer made. But she also was really involved in radio programming in Canada. And those of you that are familiar with radio might know that Canada has a really kind of long and rich history with the radio, with radio plays and radio documentaries and things like that, and kind of more experimental radio practices. But she was really interested in kind of incorporating the soundscape recordings and the soundscape approaches of R. Murray Schaefer into her kind of radio practice. So thinking about how she could maybe add narrative to soundscapes and storytelling to this practice of making soundscapes. And another practice that she starts to develop is the practice of sound walks. So a sound walk, as she defines it, is any excursion whose main purpose is listening to the environment. It is exposing our ears to every sound around us, no matter where we are. So I really like the practice of sound walks because I think it takes this kind of like highfalutin idea of like making a field recording or sort of like acousmatic listening, or even the kind of listening that John Cage talks about. It makes it so that it's basically just wherever we are, whenever we are, we can always just kind of like take a moment to kind of tune in a little deeper to the sounds that are around us. And if you're walking and you're really tuned in to the sounds around you, you can hear how the sounds are kind of changing as you go. And Hildegard Westerkamp was really interested in this kind of phenomenon. And again, it's really simple. It's just this idea of kind of having attentive listening or being in a state of increased awareness to the sounds around you. And this is, again, something that kind of something everyone can do. And she often recorded while she went on these sound walks. And also now these days that we all have cell phones and things like that, anyone could kind of probably go out and record the sounds around them as they walked anywhere. You could do this in a city, you could do this in a forest, you could do it in a suburb. It doesn't matter where you are, you can do a sound walk. And a lot of the sound walks that Westerkamp undertook, she either made maps and instructions so that someone could kind of recreate it on their own, or sometimes the instructions were so loose that they could kind of do them anywhere. But then she also made recordings and made kind of pieces based on these sound walks. And the one that we're going to talk about is called Kitts Beach Sound Walk, and that was recorded in Kitts Beach in Vancouver. And the thing that I love about the sound walk is that you hear the sounds as she's walking, just like kind of all the sounds that are around her, and that includes kind of the sound of the water, the sound of her footsteps. You hear city sounds, you hear kind of like horns honking and stuff way in the background. And she narrates her walk as she goes. So this again is kind of like maybe more of like an integration between like a radio storytelling practice and the soundscapes of Schaeffer. So you hear the kind of general soundscape as she goes, and then you also hear her narrating what she's listening to as she goes. And what she starts to do, first she just kind of describes the sounds that she's hearing, the water hitting the shore, the barnacles, the gurgling sounds that she hears as the water like goes through, kind of the tide pools. She describes kind of her setting, and then she starts to talk about kind of how the recording is technologically mediated. She says, I could fool you or trick you into thinking that the sounds around me are this loud. And she kind of removes a lot of the city noise and boosts up the sound of the kind of natural sounds around her. But she says, but actually the sounds are really more like this. And then you get more of like a balance that it's like the natural sounds are actually kind of far away and sound really kind of similar to some of the more like human-made sounds. And then the further along she goes on this walk, she also starts to kind of expand into kind of more of an inner space or a dream space. So she moves and shifts from kind of describing the sounds outside of her and around her to describing her inner thoughts. She starts talking about a dream that she had and the sounds that she heard in a dream and going to this kind of more inner monologue. And so I think that this is like a really creative expansion of Schaeffer's environmental soundscapes, that kind of like pure environmental sounds, to then where we go to like a real awareness of how these soundscapes are mediated and also kind of include our inner space. Because if you can imagine, if we're in a given place at a given time, we are not separate from our thoughts while we're there. And so Hildegard Westerkamp kind of presents this really integrated sense of like herself with her environment and kind of brings us along in the journey. And so this is one of your required listenings for this section, so make sure that you go back and listen to it. So now we're really going to focus on kind of this second strand that I talked about, which is more composers that are interested in environmental sounds as sort of musical material. And I'm going to take a little break, and then we'll come back and talk about these composers. So now we're going to talk about some of the composers in kind of this second camp that I mentioned, who think about sounds of the environment more as sort of source material or musical material, and are interested in more of just like the kind of sounds themselves, to say it in kind of a John Cagey way. And the first that we're going to talk about is a composer that we're already familiar with, so I'm not going to do as much introduction here. But as you can remember, when we talked about Inea Lockwood, when we talked about performance art, she was really interested early on in her career in making recordings of kind of different sound materials. So remember, she went through a phase where she made a bunch of recordings of glass, of lots of different elements of glass, of running different materials along glass, of different kinds of glass, of ringing glass, of breaking glass. And then she started her fire burning or piano burning series because she wanted to make a recording of fire. So really throughout her, even in those early days, she started to make recordings of kind of the sounds in her environment. I mentioned that she spent most of her career at being a professor at Hunter College in New York. And so she started to make treks up to the Hudson River and would make recordings of the river there. And just kind of, she had a real rich kind of practice of making recordings. So just kind of wherever she was, she would make recordings. And in the 1980s, she started making a series called the Sound Maps series or the River Diary series, where she made sound maps of different rivers. And so let's unpack that idea of a sound map really quick. So you can imagine maybe what would a sound map consist of? When we use a regular map, these days we probably are just using Google Maps. But a map kind of includes, it just like kind of charts out a space. It says there's rivers there, these are the roads, it labels things. Things tend to be to scale. So a sound map is kind of like a sonic analog. But she says of these river diaries that her intention is not to document these rivers, but rather for the special state of mind and body which the sounds of moving water creates when one listens intently to the complex mesh of rhythms and pitches. So again, this is the idea that she's not really trying to make an exact document or exact representation of these rivers, but she really wants to give a sense of kind of what these sounds are and just like the sonic character of the river as it changes, from one bend to the next, as she kind of says. And another thing that I really love about what Anea Lockwood does is that she kind of separate from kind of Armory Schaefer, she includes any of the sounds that are there. So your required listening for this section is the sound map of the Danube. And the Danube River is the second largest river in Europe, and it goes through 10 different countries. So you can imagine in Europe, many different languages are spoken in Europe. And I think what's interesting about this piece is that I think she spent something like 3 years recording this along this river. She made 5 different trips to the river, and I don't think she went through all 10 countries, but she went through many different countries. And so while she's there, she's recording on the shore, but there are people along the river. So, people sounds are included, and you get a different kind of sonic character of kind of the different cultures that happen along the river as she makes her way across the river. But you also get a sense just through the sounds that maybe there's different, the river formation, the land formations are different, that there's different plants, there's different animals, there's different insects there. So she often records sounds on the banks of the river, she records sounds above the water, she records sounds below the water, and she often does interviews with people while she is there. So you get this kind of really rich sense of kind of what the ecosystem is like on the river. So again, we get a real sense of the way in which that people are really integrated along with their environment and integrated into the life of this river. Again, kind of a sense of the ecosystem of this river that includes animals, plants, water, wind, weather, people. It includes all these different things. So you get this real rich sense of kind of all the different elements of this ecosystem. So this is your required listening for the piece. She did put it out on a CD, and she's also kind of done different installations in museums for these pieces. So the sound map of the Hudson was sort of installed in the Museum of the Hudson River, and it had surround sound speakers and images from along the river. This is one of them on the Danube. So please go back and listen to selections of the sound map of the Danube. I've also included here an interview with Anea Lockwood and one of my friends, composer Mayan Sadka, who is based in Tel Aviv and does a lot of kind of soundscape recordings and is kind of inspired by the environmental sound art that we've talked about. And she has this really great conversation with Anea Lockwood. So I included it here, and I'll include it on Canvas so you can go back and listen to that. So now we're going to talk about another composer who sort of is in this second camp that's more interested in kind of environmental sounds as musical material and as environment as sort of musical interactions. So his early work they were site specific, which meant that they were written for a specific place. With specific instrumentation. And the idea of these early pieces was both to capture a sense of that place, but also to create interactions between humans and their environments. And that kind of grew to consist of environments between humans, technology, and their environments. And I'll explain a little bit more later. So one of the first pieces that he did is called Nexus 1. And this is a piece that happened in the Grand Canyon in a specific grove. And there were these sort of like cave rock structures. And the idea was that a trumpet player was supposed to create these different kind of sounds and basically play an improvisation with this rock formation, because the way in which the rock was formed, it created these really interesting acoustic phenomena. And something happened when he and this trumpet player went out to the Grand Canyon to record this piece, which is that while the trumpet player was kind of engaging with this rock formation and creating different kind of reverb and echo effects and different kind of sonic effects in collaboration with this landscape, several crows started to kind of make sound that seemed to be in a way that was also interacting with this landscape and with this trumpet player. And that sort of inspired David to move on to this next piece, which is your required listening for this section. It's a piece called Mimus Polyglottis. And for those of you that are familiar with Latin bird names, Mimus polyglottis is the Latin name for a mockingbird. And this piece consists of a real-time interaction between a chaotic oscillator and a mockingbird. And this piece is both fascinating and a little bit disturbing, but the idea was that David became really interested in creating situations of interspecies communication. He was really interested in seeing if he could communicate with animals using sound. And so what you'll hear is he was really fascinated by the ways in which mockingbirds could mimic human sounds. So like the sounds of car alarms was a big one, but also maybe the sounds of talking. And he wanted to see kind of if he could sort of push the mockingbird to its limits by playing at these kind of chaotic square wave sounds. And so on the one hand, it's really fascinating because the bird does a really great job of mimicking elements of these sounds, but you can also hear there are moments when it's frustrated, and it kind of sounds like it's almost being tortured, but then you kind of hear that the bird sort of like pushes through and again kind of starts to mimic elements of the sound. So it's a really interesting piece. And then his later pieces, which aren't one of your required listenings, he creates these really complicated systems that include kind of oscillators and sound-making devices that include human musicians, and that also include feedback devices where there are microphones kind of feeding into the oscillators, like almost like a Gordon Muma hornpipe situation, but with an environment, and it creates these kind of interactive feedback systems. And those are really complex, so we're not going to talk about those in depth, but that is kind of where he goes with these pieces. And again, it's just to try to see if he could set up not only these like meaningful interactions with the environment, but also some kind of communication with an environment and the creatures in an environment. So I also want to mention a piece that David did more recently in some of his more recent work, which is a piece called The Sound of Light in Trees. And this piece was the result of many years of collaboration with a scientist and mathematician named Jim Crutchfield. And this piece was sort of motivated by two things. One, sort of out of creating these complex systems, David started to explore more kind of like chaotic oscillator systems, and he created a system of 8 interconnected chaotic oscillators. Don't worry, you don't need to remember that, but it's basically just like this complex feedback network of oscillators, and it creates these really unpredictable kind of sounds, basically, rich and unpredictable sounds. And he also started to become close with the scientist, Jim Crutchfield, who was starting to research the impact of bark beetle infestations on pinyon pine forests in New Mexico. And this is relevant to all of us here in California, who might know that a lot of the recent wildfires, one of the reasons why they've gotten so much worse is not just that temperatures are warming and that we're in seasons of drought, but there are also these huge infestations of bark beetles which ravage trees and kill trees. So it basically creates this just like dry kindling that's just like ripe for a fire to like feed a fire. So it kind of increases the fuel of these fires. And this like idea that these forests were being impacted in this way just like really weighed heavily on David Dunn, and he tried to think of some way in which he could help. So as you can imagine from his early experiments of playing sound to this mockingbird, throughout his career, whenever he goes into an environment or a new place, he doesn't just make recordings of those places, he also often plays sounds to things in these places. So he got the idea that maybe he could play the sounds of this chaotic oscillator to these bark beetles to just see what would happen. And it ended up leading to this experiment with Jim Crutchfield in which they found that playing these bark beetles, these chaotic oscillator sounds, basically made them go cannibalistic and suicidal in a way that would, and also infertile, so it could basically decimate entire bark beetle populations, which sort of led David to propose the use of sound as an alternative to chemical pesticides. So I'm just going to say that again. Here we get a composer who starts to collaborate with a scientist that leads to an experiment in which he proposes the use of sound as an alternative to chemical pesticides. And so I just kind of want to point out here that this is a huge difference between someone like David Dunn and someone like R. Murray Schafer, where R. Murray Schafer's like, we're going to solve the environmental crisis by making soundscape recordings and increasing people's awareness to noise pollution and pollution, the harmful effects of humans on the environment. To David Dunn, who's like, I've created this chaotic oscillator and we're going to use these sounds to kill bugs and actually stop some of the harmful effects of climate change. So it's just a real radical kind of shift in difference where as a composer, he's like, increasing awareness is not going to do a lot. We really need, but as a composer, as an artist, I have a really interesting insight into the ways in which sound is playing a role here. And I think that sounds could be used as an alternative to chemical pesticides. So, and he actually has kind of, he's patented this and has talked to different people in industry, and there is a chance that it could be picked up and be used in industry as an alternative to, say, Monsanto chemical pesticides and things like that. So make sure that you go back and listen to Mimus Polyglottis because that is your required listening for this section. Okay, so lastly, we're going to talk about another composer who kind of operates in a similar vein as David Dunn and who is very much inspired by David Dunn. And it's a Spanish ecologist and composer named Francisco Lopez. And Francisco Lopez started his career as an entomologist. He studied bugs. And he was inspired when he did his field work in South America in rainforests there by kind of the ideas of Pierre Schaeffer, of this idea of acousmatic listening, because he realized when he was doing his research that a lot of the sounds that happen in the rainforest are by creatures that you can't actually see. So there's insects that are really small, or they're, in holes or behind plants or whatever. A lot of the sounds that you're hearing in a rainforest or hearing in an environment are actually sounds that you can't see. And so he sort of and he kind of comes up with this idea of blind listening, that you can really get a lot out of listening to a soundscape blind, that you don't have to see what you're hearing. And he takes what is now considered an ecological approach, where he makes field recordings and soundscape recordings in which he tries to kind of get a sense of the environment or the soundscape as a whole. But kind of unlike R. Murray Schafer, he sort of rejects a lot of the premises of acoustic ecology and says that field recordings are always a creative act, that field recordings are not transparent, they're not neutral, and they really reflect the values and perspectives of their creators. So it's kind of like some of the critical elements that we've been talking about. And he does this in a piece called La Selva, in which he records a forest called La Selva. He makes a lot of recordings of animals, insects, and also, again, tries to get a sense of the soundscape as a whole. And he tries, again, to not just focus on animals and insects, but also plants, on wind, on weather. So kind of more like a Nea Lockwood of getting a sense of kind of the whole ecosystem. And he says that and he really encourages listeners to try to focus on that wholeness, to try to hold all the sounds together in your mind's ear as you're listening. So not to focus in on one sound or another, but try to keep your focus on a sense on the sense of the whole. And he says of this piece, what you hear on La Selva, the recording, is not La Selva. So again, he's really highlighting the fact that this is just a sound object. It is taken out of context. This is a mediated creative product. It is not in any way a pure or transparent representation or document of this place. So this is your last listening for this section. Please make sure that you go back and listen to it. And there's tons of people making making field recordings and soundscape recordings now. A lot of these things have kind of bubbled up to the surface and are now included more in popular music and film scores and things like that. So I'm sure you'll have a lot of things that you'll want to add to the discussion on Canvas. All right, and again, if you have any questions, post them there as well.